So welcome to today's webinar where we're going to be talking about the principles of multimedia learning, and this webinar is probably a little bit different to some of the others that we've done, and it's a bit more of the theory side of things. So to be honest, I was pleasantly surprised when I saw how many people registered for this one, because I thought I was the only one that liked this kind of stuff. But hopefully you all will be able to take something away from this as well, because I really find this stuff quite interesting, and I guess for me, coming to grips with a lot of this stuff has just sort of come from my own personal interests. So hopefully you might from today be able to take something away and maybe check some of this stuff out for yourself. Now, what I'm talking about today in terms of the theory and I've got a few slides and a couple of models and things like that. I still like reading books, and I know we live in this digital age, but give me a hard copy book any day. And one of the ones that I bought in relation to this particular topic is this one called eLearning and the Science of Instruction. It's a little bit old now, and it's a little bit sort of more worse for wear, but I find it's been a really good book, and I guess it's where I've sort of summarised a bit of the stuff from it for today's webinar. And what I really like about it is it talks about the theory and these principles, and then gives us some ideas of some things that we can do to incorporate into our e-learning design. It's an easy read, and I mean I didn't read it from start to finish, but you certainly can cherry pick different parts from it. So definitely worth checking out by Ruth Colvin Clark and Richard Mayer. Actually, Ruth Colvin Clark's got a number of books out related to sort of, that incorporates this kind of stuff into it. There's a graphics one and a few others, so worth checking out. And the other one that also references some of this stuff as well as some others is one by Julie Dirksen called Design for How People Learn. Now, the one that I'm showing there, the one that I've got was the first edition. It's actually into a second edition now. So again, if you're interested in knowing a bit more about this kind of brain processing stuff and this theoretical kind of stuff, again, it's in there, and again, it's written in a fairly easy to read kind of a way that you can grab different parts. So they're probably, if I was going to recommend a couple of books on this sort of topic, these would be the two that I would definitely recommend. So in today's session, we're going to start off by having a look at this cognitive theory of multimedia learning that was put together by a guy called Mayer, Richard Mayer. Now, just let me know in the chat area, have you heard of it before? Have you heard of this theory? Now, that could be why you're here today, I realise that. But let me know if you've even just heard of it, maybe vaguely. If not, that's okay. But yeah, let us know. That's sort of our first little question for the day, if you've heard of this stuff before. So a few of you have, some no. That's okay, it's all good. I'm with you, Stephen. I'm a big fan of his as well. So no, that's okay. Yeah, and you may have heard and may not have. So what it is, and we'll talk about it, it's really a theory about kind of how we process information, I guess, in a nutshell. And from that, there was a number of principles that were developed to try to improve our design, to try to help improve that processing of information. Now, the 5 that I've got listed there are the ones we're going to look at, but there are more than that. There are actually more, and if you look in Ruth Colvin Clark's book, you'll see some other ones in there as well. But we're kind of going to stick with those 5. And the good thing with these principles is they kind of create some guidelines so that we can maybe follow as best we can that are based on what we know about the capabilities of human memory and processing of information. So that's where we're sort of headed. So I guess for myself, when I started in the e-learning side of things, I didn't have a dream when I was a kid that I wanted to do that as a job. I transitioned into it, which maybe like a lot of you did. And when you're putting together a piece of e-learning, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of balls we've got to juggle. Some of you may do all of those things or most of those things, but it can be complicated. It can be a lot to take in. And I guess my motivation for being interested in the, I guess, the learning theory side of things came from that I knew I had to do all that, but because I didn't really come from an e-learning background, I kind of thought that I probably should find out some stuff so that I don't look silly when I'm talking to people about, you know, e-learning and stuff like that. So it was more of a fear of getting found out that I didn't really know what I was talking about. So that was another reason why I got into this sort of thing. But I think that knowing a little bit about learning theory, it puts us in a better position when we're talking to subject matter experts or, you know, clients and those kinds of things, especially when they want to include something that maybe isn't going to be great for learning. It's going to maybe impact learning in some kind of way. So it sort of you know, puts us a bit more in a position of strength, because a part of what we're doing as designers and instructional designers, learning designers, is that we're bringing, you know, our knowledge of this kind of learning stuff to the table. We're kind of the learning experts. We may not have subject matter expertise, so we need to be, in a lot of ways, advocates for learning and for the learners. So that we can sort of get the best outcomes, and obviously there's some give and take there between everyone. So the theory of multimedia learning is important, because essentially when we're putting together some design, we often start with some content of some kind, and then we have to, you know, weave our magic and create something, you know, for distribution to the masses. And ultimately, we want it to, I guess, enter into people's minds, and hopefully they'll learn something. And you know, the idea really being that they will improve their performance, which is really the end goal of a lot of the times of what we're doing. We want them to improve their performance. So I guess, yeah, starting from, well, let's think about maybe how people process information and that kind of thing might help us right back at the start. So I guess we're sort of in a way starting at the end and coming back to the start. So this particular theory, it's called multimedia learning, but essentially it's around e-learning. They have a quite simple definition in terms of the definition they use. And when they talk about words, they're talking about narration, text on the screen, that kind of thing, and graphics. It's all encompassing: illustrations, animations, photos, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's, I guess, the definition of multimedia learning that we're kind of working off for this particular theory. Now, the Mayer's theory, his cognitive theory of multimedia learning, he actually built that on some theory that was done prior, a while ago, a long time ago, sort of in the, you know, the early 1900s, and everything kind of built on it. So, you know, there was a guy called Pavio who had this dual coding theory. There was Badley who looked at, you know, working memory and that sort of thing, which we'll talk a bit more about working memory in a second, and then Sweller's cognitive load theory. So Mayer's kind of taken, you know, built on those theories, and those ones are worth a look if you're interested, and he's created this this multimedia learning specifically for this particular context. Okay, so it was built on those sorts of things. So far so good. Let me know in the chat if you've got any questions, and let me know in the chat as we're going through if you've got any questions. But that's sort of where we're about to launch into the model itself right about now. Okay, so our model, the Mayer's model, I should say, because it's not, I guess it's not my model. I'm just presenting their model, his model. So we start off with the model. We have some e-learning, which, as the definition and as it does, usually made up of a mixture of words and pictures, you know, all kind of cobbled together, you know, obviously in a structured kind of a way, put together. And the first, when we're looking at processing of that information, the multimedia, the e-learning that's presented is obviously processed by our ears and our eyes. Okay. Now I know we use our hands to, you know, manipulate the mouse or touch the screen or whatever, but technically that's not processing the information. The information is actually coming into our brains through our eyes and our ears. So for words, we have things like, depending on whether they're spoken or they're just written on the screen, could be processed by either or both. And then obviously our pictures is predominantly processed by our eyes. Okay, so we've kind of got two channels of processing information. Then once the information goes through our senses, you know, we don't necessarily process every piece of information. It doesn't kind of stick, but it goes through what's known as phonetic and visual processing. So this is what's happening in our working memories. So if you know much about working memory, the capacity of our working memory is actually quite limited. If you were interested, there's a guy by the name of Miller. He wrote an article a while ago called The Magic Number 7 plus or minus 2, and that was around about trying to get an idea of, well, how much information can we hold in our working memories. But what, I guess the numbers aren't important, it's just that it's not very much. Okay, so they can tend to get overloaded if we present people with too much information to try to take in all at once. And then once the info goes through our working memories, you know, we have also another area in our brains called the long-term memory, which is pretty much where we store information. In Julie Dirkson's book, she refers to it as like shelves, which they kind of are, yeah, or I sometimes think of them as like filing cabinets. So we put all of the information into those things for retrieving at some point later. The technical term they use in the books and stuff is called schema. So you have different schema for different things. And that's where we want, I guess, the information to end up in our long-term memory, or as much of it as we can. But as people are processing information, you know, there is some integration potentially with prior knowledge and stuff that they already might know, okay? And then things might change, or things get rejected based on prior knowledge, or sort of stuff like that. So this, I guess, is what Mayer developed as a theory of the cognitive architecture of how our brains are processing information, in particular from an eLearning multimedia piece. Okay, so it's going through those steps. Now, depending on the way we present it, obviously how much, but you know, the way we present the information, we can overload the working memory because it can't hold too much. And what I should have said, I'm just going to go back one, is that the theory that Mayer developed, it was based around three assumptions. One, that we've got it's a dual channel processing system, so the eyes and the ears being the dual channel. The other was around that we've got limited capacity in our working memories to hold information and you know, get it to our long-term memory. He also based it on that there was, you know, there's a fair bit of cognitive processing that's going on through those channels when we're trying to learn something. So when we're actively trying to learn something. So he's based his theory around that. Now, if you're looking at when we look at the cognitive demands placed on people when they are specifically doing, you know, some multimedia or e-learning, there are three kinds of cognitive demands. The first one is called essential processing. So that's, you know, what people need to do to make sense of what they're being presented. Okay. There's another form of demand called incidental processing. So if there is stuff that we've got in there that's not really related, but it's in there just to kind of pretty stuff up, or, you know, that kind of thing, it's not supporting the learning in any way. It's called incidental processing. If it's still there, potentially people are processing that. And then there's another type of demand called representational holding, which is kind of a fancy term. But what that means is it's about having people having to hold information in their working memory to kind of use in other parts of the course. And given that, you know, if they have to do that a lot, again, that can overload the capacity of their working memory. So we can't really do much about essential processing. You know, we need that to be able to get people to learn something. But the incidental and the representational holding, if we have stuff in our courses that's causing people causing this demand on their cognitive capacity, that can have an impact on them learning overall from what it is that we're presenting them. So we need to think about that. And we need to think about, well, what can we do that maybe we can cut down on this incidental and representational holding so that people can just focus on the essential processing of what it is they're being presented. So I guess this is where these principles came into being. That you know, other researchers and Mayer and others did research on different kind of, just they focused on different aspects of multimedia learning or e-learning, and then they came up with these principles or kind of guidelines that you can, you know, try to follow, that might help to eliminate those things and just so people can focus on the incidental or the essential side of the processing. So how are we going? Just so while I have a quick drink, let me know in the chat if you've got any questions so far. Okay, cool. Good. Okay, sweet. Well, I'll keep moving. So we're going to look at the, I'm going to show some examples which I'll talk about representational, Amanda. Yeah, it's one of the principles that deals with that specifically. It's not, to be honest, it's not kind of one that I see a lot of, but yeah, I guess with these principles and the example, because I had to just make up an example of something, you might have to think about it in your particular context, and maybe not all of the principles will always necessarily apply to what you're kind of putting together. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. So the first one I'm going to look at is a principle called the Multimedia Principle. Okay, so that talks about that people learn more deeply from words and graphics than just from words alone. Now, when I go through these principles, I'll probably say, you know, the research said this and the research said that. It's not all the same research. It's different studies and different things that were done. But again, they've all I've referenced them from Clark and Mayer's book. Okay, so you know, some people did some research onto, well, you know, does it make a difference if there's words and pictures? Now, and what they found was that if there were images, if there were pictures, that generally tended to result in better learning in the studies that they did. Okay, and obviously the way this kind of research tends to work is they might do a few studies and then it's kind of, you know, extrapolated out so we can kind of apply it to other things. So here we have it, and today's little example is, I guess the easiest one I could find was it's about a coffee machine. Most of it's about a coffee machine. So I guess what the multimedia principle is saying is if we've got this text on the screen, and I know we could kind of stage it to come on one after the other in an e-learning module, that it's saying that if we have a picture there, that would help people to maybe learn better. But what you generally might see, and I know you see it a lot in PowerPoint, is that you end up with getting a picture it's kind of vaguely related to the information, but you know, you get the request that, oh, we need to jazz up the slide, or we need to, you know, we need to make it a bit more interesting because the content's really dry. So we tend to you know, put something on there that's kind of vaguely related, and it's referred to, this kind of thing is referred to as using decorative images to spice things up. But what's happening is people are still processing that information, and it hasn't really got a lot to do, and it still requires some cognitive processing. So you're better off having something that's a bit more related to what it is that you're talking about. Now, I understand that does get more difficult when you are talking about more abstract kind of topics, but that could come back to maybe we need to structure it in a different way, that you know, it isn't so abstract and simplified, or maybe use icons and different sorts of things to help try to explain things. But they found that, yeah, using images that are related to the content is a better way of doing it. Now, the other, and the reason I also picked these 5 principles is because they kind of build on one another a little bit, because looking at the pictures and words, you're still only kind of using the one channel. You're still only using the eyes. You're still only processing it visually. Now, there's this one here, the contiguity, it's a bit of a mouthful to say, is that people learn more deeply when words and graphics are placed close to one another, or when spoken, words and graphics spoken at the same time. So what that's saying, there's a couple of types of contiguity. it used to be kind of called split attention, but they don't really refer to it too much. But you might see some stuff if you look it up on split attention. It's the same kind of thing. So there's two kinds of contiguity. One is called spatial, where you're physically on the same slide. You might have some information and images, but they're not near each other, and people kind of have to scan backwards and forwards. The other one's called temporal contiguity, and Amanda, this goes back to the representational holding. Temporal contiguity is about if there was information on one slide and I had to kind of keep that into my working memory, and then maybe the next slide or even the one after that, then use that information to go with this information and put it together and try and make sense of it. So they're both different types of contiguity, but Amanda, that's where the representational holding comes in, temporal contiguity, where you have to try and remember a piece of information in one part of the course to use on another part, and that could be words, pictures, audio, or anything like that. So this next slide that I've got is an example. This is spatial contiguity. So again, still using our pretend coffee example, so that I have to keep going from the text on the left over to the diagram on the right, and to match things up. Okay. Now, I guess the thing with these principles is that they're not saying that is. I could still learn what those different parts of the coffee machine are, or whatever it is that you're presenting this way. What the principles are saying is that if we did it in a different way, it's going to be less demand cognitively. So instead of presenting something like this where everything's kind of separated, we could present something where everything's a bit kind of close together and makes a little bit more sense, hopefully, for people. So it's trying to keep things, I guess, together. I guess if I use an example from, say, in Storyline, if you were showing somebody a process, and if you had different parts of the process on layers, and you showed one part and then you showed another layer, and then that first bit hid and all that, that's a bit of temporal contiguity, because you've got to remember the first part of the process while you're looking at the second part, and then you've got to look at the third part of the process and try and remember the other two. So that kind of thing, that's where again, representational holding, but contiguity. But also the spatial is about trying to keep associated words and images closer to one another. So, try and position things when you're designing so that things are positioned a little bit more. So any stuff that's related kind of goes together. And again, it helps to reduce that cognitive demand. Okay, the next one's called the Modality Principle, and I've put the little our little diagram of our cognitive architecture up in the corner, trying to reduce the temporal contiguity, so you didn't have to remember it from a few slides ago. This principle says that people, and what they found was people learn more deeply when on-screen text that describes an image or a graphic is replaced by audio. Okay, so it kind of, the reason what they found in this one and why there were benefits was because we weren't just using the one sense, the one processing channel. We were splitting it between the two. So we can take some words off the screen and use that as narration. Now, I know the research was done a little while ago, but even the researchers, they talk about some exceptions to some of these things. And in this particular case, they found that if people were familiar with the content, it didn't really matter to them if the words described the graphics, or people that weren't native speakers of a particular language, they might need all of the words there to describe. So there's some exceptions as we work through this kind of stuff. So what we have, I guess, as an example here, excuse me, is that we have the information on the screen. Now, we've tried to reduce the contiguity by having the stuff a bit closer together, but it's all kind of there, and the words are just describing the different parts, but it's all kind of there. Again, we could have staggered it so that we show one bit after another, or give the users some control. That would help as well. But what this principle is really talking about is it's all text, it's all visual. It's just we're processing it through the eyes, that we could do something maybe like this. The group head is part of the machine where hot water flows into the coffee beans held in the filter handle. Filter handles hold ground coffee under the group head. This is a double or twin spout head. The steam wand or arm is used for frothing milk. The wand dispenses dry steam under high pressure. Something like that. I know I'm not a great audio person, but something like that. So you were getting that information visually and auditory, helping to again spread that cognitive load, and hopefully you might learn a bit about coffee machines today as well. So that's what the modality principle is really talking about here, is trying to make use of both of those processing channels where possible. And again, I get it as well. You know, you might not have, your people might not be able to have audio and you might not be able to do it that way, but where possible, something like this can help to reduce the cognitive demand on people when they're trying to learn something. Okay, the fourth one that I wanted to look at is the redundancy principle. So what that's talking about is that people learn more when you explain something that's happening on the slide rather than just reading out the words word for word. Okay, now again, I realise there's exceptions with accessibility and stuff like that, but maybe you could give people the option to turn that captioning and that sort of thing on or off. So rather than having somebody read, the group head is part of the machine where hot water flows onto the coffee beans held in the filter handle. Filter handles hold ground coffee under the group head. This is a double or twin spout head. The steam wand or arm is used for frothing milk. The wand dispenses dry steam under high pressure. Now, there's a couple of things there. One is probably that you probably read to the end of those little bits of text before I finish reading them. So that can happen, but you're really processing the same information between both channels. So one of them becomes redundant. So that's why, I guess, looking at the modality one before, that you're making better use of both channels rather than I guess overloading them by pushing the same information through both channels. And Jens is right, yeah, multiple channels are good for accessibility as well. Okay, folks, and we've got one more principle to go, and that is what's called the Personalisation Principle. Now, it is related to the cognitive architecture model, so some people did some research to find out, well, is the way the words and the text are written, can that help with the way people process? And so the findings were that where there's a heightened social presence, what that means is that's when you use the word you in a module. So you're talking about you're going to do this or we're going to do that sort of thing. Conversational language, so writing sort of how you might talk instead of a more formal kind of a way. And a learning agent, again, is I guess a fancy way of saying maybe a character. Now, what they found in the research again was that it didn't matter what the character looked like, whether it was a cartoon or a human. So in the test that they did, it didn't really matter. It didn't even matter if the character was on the screen all the time. So if you used a character and it was like the character was doing the narration, it didn't matter sometimes if the character wasn't there and it was being narrated, because people kind of knew who was talking. And they did find that the words presented in a conversational rather than formal was preferred by people in sort of the learning tests that they did. So I've got an example that I'll get you to have a read of this piece of text. I'm going to show you two. Have a read of this piece of text first. Okay, so that's the first one. Now have a read of this piece of text. When you've read them, yeah, let me know in the chat area which one you prefer. Because essentially both of those pieces of text are saying exactly the same thing. It's just the way it was written. The second one is trying to personalize it a little bit, using using more conversational language. It refers to you, and it's like it is talking to you and referring to you. Plus, what I also like about it is that it's you know, the first one looks like it's cut and pasted out of a policy document or something like that, whereas the second one is kind of, as well as being conversational, it relates to maybe a situation the person's going to find themselves in, which is, you know, important for what we're doing as well. So one of the things that they did find in the research was that, the experiment that they did was they just they added the word you to the text a number of times, and then that's how they sort of came to the, so it was referring to somebody personally. But they did sort of also put a word of caution that that overdoing it can become distracting if it's kind of too much. But, you know, I think the second one is pretty good too, and I do like that a little bit better. It's not like I'm the first one I feel is a little bit like I'm being lectured at, whereas the second one it's like someone's someone's kind of coaching me through it. So that kind of thing. So again, something to maybe to keep in mind when you're you know, writing. So the writing can have an impact on your the cognitive demand and then the learning. So folks, that's kind of it. I know we've only spent like half an hour or so, but I kind of thought that that is probably, I didn't want to overload your cognitive capacity too much, so I deliberately kind of made it for 30 minutes today rather than 40. So questions. I'm just going to have a quick look at some questions. So Kate, now the cartoon characters, yes, we get that as well sometimes. Sometimes what Kate's saying is sometimes people don't, you know, find the cartoon characters, you know, find them disrespectful in Kate's case, or they're not, yeah, they're not wearing the same clothes. I kind of get I definitely get all of that. But you could maybe, if you're going to use a character, if you got someone in the uniform, or because sometimes people think the cartoon characters are not taking the topic seriously, if that makes sense, because this is important, and you got a cartoon telling me that. So yes, so maybe go with you know, maybe go with something a bit more realistic, or even just the voiceover of somebody saying that. If you've, and I know it's only just come out yesterday, if you've upgraded to the new Articulate 360, and in Storyline 360 they have some less cartoony looking characters in there. They're still illustrated, but they look a bit more realistic. So so yes, yeah, and Ash, even the real life, yeah, some people just don't just it's a hard sell. But I guess if you wanted to try to maybe get it through, again, you wouldn't have to put them on every slide, but again, you could maybe come and you know, refer to that, you know, some of the that it might be more helpful for learning. And I guess the thing too would be, I guess, you know, your people, I guess, you know, not the people taking the courses. So it could be even doing some experiments yourself with those, and sort of seeing what they kind of find. Now, look, I have used, not all the time, but Julie, yes, I have used cartoon. I can find cartoons. The illustrators can work all right on a picture background. Yeah, they most certainly can. And I guess it's about keeping it consistent. Yeah. Marina, Articulate's just come out with a new a product called Articulate 360, and part of that is there's a new version of Storyline in that. So you'll probably get some information. Now, I'll talk about it in a sec when we're finished, but we are going to run a few webinars in a couple of weeks. They're only going to be 15-minute little webinars that are going to be all about, you know, some of the new features in Articulate 360 Storyline, and they've got some new tools in there as well. That you can use, which I'll talk a little bit about those at the end if you like. Jen's common mistakes, I guess some of them relate to what I've spoken about, so where people get people to read everything on the slide, having extra information on there that's not really necessary, or people put things on there just to either fill up the slide because there's not enough stuff on there. That's a fairly common one. To be honest, even, and sometimes, and I know we're bound by the marketing and corporate style guides of things, but even something like, you know, a logo, and I know I've got one on here on my PowerPoint, but you know, a logo on all the way throughout is again, it's another piece of information that people have to process, and really, I guess people do know where they are if they're doing their piece of e-learning at work. So is it really necessary? But I know we have to weigh that up with the way that our organisations work and what our clients kind of want. Stephen, I personally, and again, it's probably come from all the stuff that I've read, would say not to narrate everything, not word for word anyway, but again, for accessibility, you might need to, but in that case, I'd give people maybe the option of turning the narration off so that they don't necessarily, if they don't want to listen to the whole thing, maybe not kind of forcing them to do it could be a way to do that. Rather than, yeah, like I said, making them kind of sit through everything, and which you can do. I know in something like Storyline, you can use some variables to turn the narration on or off, or have captions instead, or something like that. You could do that. Kate's just talking about, yeah, they can, Kate, and that's what I mean. I get that. And look, the thing too, Kate, as well as if you're using people from your workplace, you know, as well as using the character like that, but that is kind of personalising it, because it makes that person more relatable. I was working on a course recently, a medical one, and you know, we weren't using actual people, but we had to get some stock images, and they didn't want us to have doctors with white coats, because doctors don't tend to wear white coats anymore. So if we had to use the white coat, that probably would have turned people off straight away. So it's trying to make it a bit more, you know, realistic for people. You could get people to choose a character. Have you done that, David, in your courses? Have you? Because you can. That could be something that you could do. They could pick from a couple or 3 different characters, and you could, again, using some variables and some different states and characters, you could do that. And again, that sort of personalizes it to them. I've read some stuff where even the act of, you know, getting people to type in their name at the start of the course, and, you know, you refer to them by name throughout the course. That's another kind of personalization kind of thing that you can do throughout the course. No, that's okay if you haven't. That's all right. But no, you're definitely right. It certainly can be done. Okay, cool. Well, I guess just some final tips before we go. It's been good to have you here and good to chat. So again, having your images relating to the content, trying to integrate, like having text near to corresponding graphics as opposed to separating them either physically on the page itself or across different pages. Using your audio to not just to read out what's happening, but to describe what's happening on the slide a little bit, so that you're sort of splitting it across those couple of channels. Don't narrate the screen word for word, not like I just did then. So yeah, just trying to use it to spread that cognitive load. That's what I tell people in the Storyline training, which is trying to spread the cognitive load across the channels. And yeah, where you can, using that conversational type language and referring to people as you, or we're going to do this, or you're going to do that kind of thing. Again, these principles that we've looked at today are just designed to help reduce that cognitive processing, and I guess get us to the point where people can get that info. We can sort of help them to get that info into their long-term memories a little bit better. Yeah. And just one final question before we go. Narrated animations. So what do you mean by that, Kate? A narrated animation? Now, just while Kate's probably typing right now, these are just some references. If you're interested in looking up some of this stuff further, the first 2 are books. So the first one is that eLearning and the Science of Instruction book. The second one is another book called Efficiency. It talks more about cognitive load theory. The third one there that's a paper, that's a journal paper And the good thing about it is available online. So you know how normally your journal articles, you have to be studying at university or something to get access to them. You can actually access that one and have a look at it. And then the last one there, Patty, by the name of a lady by the name of Patty Shank. If you've seen her on Twitter or LinkedIn, or I found her. She had this article a little while ago, just in the Online Training and Development magazine, and it was again also some points about some things that you can do to help reduce, you know, some excess cognitive processing in your online courses. So that was certainly worth a read as well. Oh, okay. So Kate, when Kate's talking about narrated animations, like Video Scribe, I'm thinking, where yes, where I don't know if you've all seen it, where you have someone talking and the hands drawing the pictures. Look, I think it looks pretty good myself. It is kind of talking, and it's between the two channels, so I would think that's okay. I guess that could be something, and the thing too with some of this research, it's starting to get a number of years old, so hopefully there'll be people, and I'd do it if someone paid me. Someone you know, is hopefully doing some research on these more recent kind of developments in multimedia or e-learning to sort of look at the impacts. But I would say that probably because you're spreading it across the two, that it probably helpful. I guess it depends on how long, because if it's really long, I guess after a while it could maybe become distracting. But certainly for sort of key things, it looks really good, and it's really clever how they do it. Thanks. If you're looking in the chat area there, Stephen's just put in a link to Patty's article. Thanks for that, Stephen. Appreciate that. But folks, that brings us to the end of today's session. Sorry, I've actually just gone a little bit over. So there's those books again. If you're interested in those, definitely worth checking it out. And Julie's is really good. And like I said, Julie's book is now in the second edition. I think it's got a yellow cover, so it's probably even better than the first one. But I found both of those were beneficial. And yeah, not to necessarily read from cover to cover, just I would go in and maybe read parts of it, and I tend to scribble in my books and highlight and mark things and stuff like that. But yeah, definitely worth checking out. But thank you all for coming and your comments. Enjoy the rest of your Friday and weekend. And if you've got any questions about any of this stuff, you know, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk about that. And if you're interested in any of our, you know, if you are going to use, if you have upgraded to Articulate 360, the new version of Articulate, if you go to our website, we're going to do some free 15-minute kind of micro, I call them micro webinars that are going to be just like 15 minutes long, and just give you a bit of an overview of some of the new features and stuff like that. So just when you scroll down the page, the links are all down the bottom here. But yeah, thanks folks. Thank you. I'm happy to do more like that, Rebecca, anytime. And I guess if you've got some suggestions for them, yeah, please let me know. But yeah, thanks heaps for coming, guys. Really